Okay.
But he has problems with his vision, his hearing.
Okay. Has he ever had braces? Has he ever had braces? No?
But we've gotten kind of to a brick wall where neuro says, MRI, and he's like, yeah, well, my dead body, so.
Okay. So we're praying for Jacob that he would be relieved of his headaches, and that good advice would be listened to, whether it comes from mom, doctors, whomever. So, anyone else? Anything else? All right. Well, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, Lord, we thank you for this evening, the meal we've been able to enjoy with our family and friends, and that we've been able to gather, Lord, to learn more about the history of the events and places and times that have to deal with your people, with your word, with the future and with the past. And Lord, we ask that we would be able to take the things we learn here tonight and to apply them in our understanding with conversations with other people, and with our ability, Lord, to grow to be people of patience and with mercy with others who don't always know the things that we know. Be with Ina and Donna as they look for whatever it is they're looking for. For all of those, Lord, tonight we've mentioned in need of healing or fixing in some way, we pray that they would be healed, that they would be fixed, that those who need guidance and wisdom would find it and would adhere to it. And we pray, Lord, for those who are traveling and moving about, and for those who are usually with us tonight who can't be, we ask, Lord, a special blessing upon them, that you would look upon them with favor, and they would look upon you, Lord, declaring who you are, not only in their own hearts, but to those around them. In Yeshua's name, amen. All right, so thank you for those of you who are joining online. So this month has been kind of geared towards the history of Israeli conflicts, simply because, as per recent events on college campuses, it appears to be evident that there are a lot of people who don't know the history of Israel as a nation state, who don't know the background of Israel and Palestine, why there's a Gaza Strip, why there's a Hamas. So this month has been, and of course, we're going to go a little over our discussion on the War of 1948. We'll go into June, just timing and things and life and all that. But we will be continuing this on into June. And actually, tonight, we're talking about Zionism. Tonight actually really deserves a part 2 and probably longer. There are whole semester-long classes committed to this subject. So we are covering everything in brief. Like even last week, we covered just briefly some of the ancient tactics and warfare of ancient Israel. Again, very surface level stuff, just to give a better understanding and a greater appreciation for some of the people in the Tanakh and the things that they did to preserve the nation of Israel, to preserve the people of Israel. So anyway, Israel's been preserved throughout history, but primarily as a people, and obviously at several points in history, to include today as a nation, as a kingdom, as a place separated out to be used for God's purposes, which was the whole point to Israel existing as a nation and as a people, was so that God could use them, as he tells Abraham, so that through you the entire earth, all the nations would be blessed. Because it's through Israel, it's through the rites of piety and righteousness in Israel, through the righteousness of the generations that do remain faithful, that we have, at some point, Mary is born. Mary is a descendant of Jacob, the house of Israel. She is born, and she is righteous, and she is, of course, commits when God comes to her, sends the angel to her, commits to bearing the Messiah, bearing the Son of God into the world, being the one who bears the incarnation of God into creation. So Israel's fight to preserve itself both allows her to be born, and ultimately it allows for Yeshua to be born, to the greatest the peak of creation, the high point of all living things, of all things created, visible and invisible. He is the greatest person there ever has been, will be, and we'll never see another like him. And we can hope to be as faithful as Mary was in committing to do what God asks of her. But it's because Israel was preserved. It's because Israel was maintained at the hands of both wise men and women and strong men and women who were willing to fight on Israel's behalf, not just against those who were wicked and idolatrous, but against those who were just looking to raid or pillage the local city, town, what have you. So, and now we're kind of getting more into the modern era. When I say modern, historians use the term modern really to describe anything after 1600, particularly as it pertains to the Industrial Revolution. So anything Industrial Revolution on is what we would consider modern. Contemporary, of course, is, relatively recent, those who are still living, things that we're still using. But, and so we're getting into the political movements now and the things within the modern world that brought about the establishment of Israel as a nation state. The place where we go today whenever we go to visit Israel, the place we take tours, the place that's in the news all the time recently, that is the place that is birthed out and established out of the political system called Zionism. Most people, you'll hear a lot of people today, they'll talk about, well, I'm not anti-Jew, I'm anti-Zionist, or I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And so, how many people know what that means? How many people who are saying that even know what that means? And I'd actually, by the end of tonight, I want to posit to you that there is no one today who is a Zionist anymore. But we'll get to that at the end. So tonight's subject is Zionism. It's important to note that Zionism, from its inception, was never a monolithic idea or movement. You have several different proto-movements that spring up primarily in Europe, especially places like Germany, places where the university is kind of coming into its crowning achievements of discovery, the peak of the Enlightenment era, late 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. It's never, until you begin to get the actual nation state declaring its independence in the region of Judea, Zionism is kind of all over the place. There's multiple different branches, or multiple different wings. Different ones want different things. Some things want things now. Some things want things through democracy and negotiations. Some groups want it through violence and active partisanry. I'm getting to that. Yeah. So, but there have been several ideological and political movements all the way up to 1948 that could be classified as Zionism. Some of them last, from the late 1800s into 1948. Some of them die off before 1948. A lot of them die off before before the 40s because of a particular event that happens in Europe, the Holocaust. And of course, after the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, there really is a swift and crushing blow to the ability for Jewish intellectuals to speak out and to meet. Of course, all the way up through the 1930s, the Nazis hamper this. And it's really because that's where they're able to meet and to discuss the future of the Jewish populations regarding the principles that are found within whichever Zionist movement they happen to be a part of. So it's also necessary to note that Zionism is not inherently a religious movement. A lot of evangelicals, when they look at if you were to ask them to define what they mean by being a Zionist, it means that they are someone who is They support the land of Israel, bolstered by biblical prophecy and biblical principles. The fact that the Jewish people are the people of God, living in the land that was given to them by God's promises. But the Zionism we're talking about, the political movement, that Zionism is not a religious movement. Matter of fact, most of Zionism's ardent champions and leaders are avowed atheists, secularists. They're intellectuals. They're members of universities. They're professors. They're authors, political leaders, political activists. They're not some of them, and we'll see that there's kind of this split between these two groups. You have the religious side, which kind of grows and wanes throughout the decades as this movement grows, and of course you have most of the leadership tend to be non-religious themselves. However, finding the religious within Zionism to be useful, as it's the one thing that really unites Jews as a whole. There's, back then you didn't have the Israeli culture that can kind of unite Jews today. If you were not super religious, odds are you still partook of some kind of Passover Seder or attended synagogue service on, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. And those, so those were the things that kept you sort of tied in still to Judaism, was the religious aspect. So they find it useful, but they themselves are not ultra-religious. They're not Orthodox, most of them. And again, this is just, they were men of their time. They were, throughout the late 18th century, 19th, early 20th century, the intellectuals within the university system were a lot of them were Jewish. The development in physics that happens in Germany and in Europe throughout the late 19th and early 20th century is primarily Jewish. That's where we get Albert Einstein. That's where we get Robert Oppenheimer. That's where we all of these are the men of their day, and none of them were super religious figures. Did you have something?
I just had a question. Is this like kind of this divide, kind of like continental versus American? Because like evangelicalism doesn't exist in Europe at this time.
No.
Right?
No.
It's like an American phenomenon and a European phenomenon kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, Zionism is primarily a European phenomenon politically. There are grains of it in America. Believe it or not, it's very heavily supported in British Christian circles. Matter of fact, there are arguments that are made that Zionism really doesn't get going until it gets the backing of British Christians. They're the ones who really actually begin to champion this idea of the Jewish people having the back in their homeland. It's where we get things like the Balfour Declaration through Balfour himself, and of course that will probably come if we do a part 2, because a lot of that comes later.
This is like the development of the late 1800s is like the
Right.
first genesis of like dispensational thought.
1860s,
Yeah, which is,
1870s.
Like bringing in that evangelical sort of like
Right.
it's still
Right.
It's still in its like
It's infancy. It's infancy. We're not gonna. What?
And did the idea come from them just taking what they read in the Book of Psalms that he would rule from Mount Zion and all?
Some of it, the religious side, comes from those prophecies. But again, this is primarily a political movement, as we'll see. So, and Yvonne, to get to your question, in simplest terms, taking all of the different factions and groups, the proto-Zionist movements that build up to the Zionist Congress in the late 1890s. Simplest terms, Zionism is the belief that ethnic Jews have the right to self-autonomy in their ancestral homeland. That is the overwhelming, just simple, bare bones. They have a right to be free. They have a right to live in their own homeland, and they have the right to be autonomous. So in other words, they have a right to be there and not be ruled by the British or the French or the Ottomans, whichever one of the imperial powers of their time. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to this idea and this position, as again, you have a variety of different beliefs and agendas happening within a lot of these proto-Zionist movements in Europe. Jewry today, worldwide today, you have Jewish communities that are both very pro-Israel and very anti-Israel. There are prominent Orthodox Jewish communities today that are completely against the state of Israel. There are Orthodox Jewish communities in the state of Israel that are against the existence of the state of Israel. A lot of secular Jewish identities today are against it. Again, you see a lot of young people on college campuses, professors, many of whom happen to be Jewish, are against the idea of the state of Israel. Again, regarding their background, though, is they believe Israel to be a Western imperial colonial venture. And of course, the popular thing to be today is to be anti-colonial, anti-colonists, anti-colonies. So, and the important thing to remember when engaging with these folks, and a lot of this is part of these classes, is how to engage with folks, is to always start with the benefit of the doubt. When these people talk, sometimes it's out of ignorance. They just don't know. They don't understand the history. They don't understand the complexity of the establishment of the state, the nation Israel. A lot of times these people are more anti-colonial than they are anti-Jewish. It doesn't mean they hate Jews. They are intellectually, academically inclined to be anti-colonialism. And so when something looks that way, they get riled up. It doesn't mean necessarily that they hate Jews. There are those people. They do exist. So when you're engaging in these conversations, it's important to remember to approach them as these people may not actually hate Jewish people. They may actually be Jewish themselves, but they have a misaligned understanding of what Israel is and what colonialism is and isn't. So many of you, I'm sure, have heard the name Theodor Herzl. Most of us here, I'm sure. Theodor Herzl he's the founder of the Zionist Congress. He's one of the main leaders and one of the recognized names of the leaders of what becomes what we would call mainstream Zionism. When Israel declares its independence and reads off its constitution, his picture is actually up in the hall where they're reading this off, declaring it, because he's one of the people that has brought ultimately the Jewish people to this place where the state of Israel is capable of having this moment of declaring independence and sovereignty over their own land and their own peoplehood. But he's a mainstay of the Zionist political wing. There's other Zionist forerunners that you may not know as well. There's a lot of these guys that even I would be willing to wager that a lot of Jewish people don't know about. Because again, like I said, there's a lot of people who just don't know the history. They just don't know the background. So there's several names I'll mention tonight. Not a ton, but enough that just to help fill the gaps of the context of growing from these proto movements to the main movement and on into pursuing actually getting Jewish people to Judea or to Ottoman Palestine or later British Palestine after the First World War. There's one by the name of Rabbi Alkalai. He really bolsters a Jewish vision for a return to the land of Israel as part of what he believed to be the Messianic era. And I say it that way because this is a different way of understanding Messianic era than we would understand it to be. We understand the Messianic era to be the era in which Yeshua will reign in a geopolitical sense, and the world will be submitted to him, submitted to his rulership. The understanding that Rabbi Alkalai has is one that is more of a age of awakening. It's less about God and an individual as the Messiah. It's more about the Jewish people, and the age within time is the Messiah. It's the Messianic age, this very kind of metaphysical idea of human beings, human behavior. So he views it as it's going to be this time of peace and prosperity for the Jewish people, again, in their own land. And he's not the only one to take this view. A lot of these guys who are forerunners to what becomes political Zionism, they move away from this idea of a miraculous messianic return to the land. So they shift from this idea that Messiah is going to come, redeem us all, and take us back to the land. But rather they move into this idea, into this thought that the messianic era is going to be an era that requires human action to claim it. In other words, we have to go actually get it ourselves if we want this to be a reality, if we want this to exist. And this is where we see the largest divide between Orthodox religious Judaism and the Zionists, is that, and again, the Orthodox are one of the largest supporters of Zionism in its beginning, on through many of the Zionist congresses, until we get closer to the 1920s and the 1930s. And then we begin to see a more definitive split between these two groups. But the Orthodox are very much of the position that if we were supposed to be in the land, God would bring us there himself. In other words, God would actually, it would be like Moses. It would be like the men of the Great Assembly, bringing the people back to the land. And that's why you have Orthodox communities today who are like, we're not going. We're not going to Israel because we don't think we should be there. And you have this other side, which is like, it's ripe for the taking. It belongs to us. We should take it. And so that's where they remain divided to this day. Part of the other divide is that begins as well is that this is towards the end of the Age of Enlightenment. And along with the Age of Enlightenment comes the Jewish Haskalah, which is it is also a Jewish Enlightenment as well. This sort of, out of this time period, we see the birth of Reform Judaism, sort of a desire, and again, not like Reform Judaism today. Reform Judaism today is, maybe God exists. Reform Judaism then is like, oh, we would like our liturgy to be in English, not just Hebrew, please. So they were very conservative. They were religious people. They just were. We want the liturgy and the worship to actually be pertinent to us as German Jews, as French Jews, as English Jews, as Spanish Jews, and American Jews. America is really kind of the birthplace of a lot of Reform Judaism, particularly in Charleston, here in the South Carolina. So it's a move away from traditional Judaism. They began moving into more secular sciences, philosophy, academia. This is why by the time we get to, right before World War II, World War I, the people holding these high stations within the university and academia, a lot of them are Jews, because the Jewish communities kind of went 100% full force into, we're going to embrace this idea of education and philosophy and thinking and science outside of our own tradition and outside of our walls of skepticism. And so this is where you see this really kind of bloom and be birthed into the world. Hasidic Judaism is birthed during this time, largely in response to all of this. So you have, Jews who are leaving Judaism because they see it as something that's dead weight, something that is holding them back from really participating in the world. And again, not in like a wicked, evil way, but in like, I view my traditions as keeping me back from being involved in the sciences, being involved in philosophy and mathematics, things that are not bad, but they're walking away from their traditions. And so Hasidic Judaism presents this alternative view of tradition and Jewish practice, one that is more focused on the beauty of piety, not simply tradition for tradition's sake. So it's sort of a rebirth of Jewish practice and tradition into this thing that allows there to be a more heartfelt. It's not just something you do ritualistically. It's something that actually incorporates and brings the full person in, not just to participate, but to see the beauty of why they're doing it. And so, that's why when people go like, well, what's the oldest sect of Judaism? And like, well, look at the Hasidic Jews. It's like, 1600s at best, my guy. Like, they're like, they're barely older than our country as a movement. So that grows in response to a lot of the secular academic growth in Europe. And so Jews begin to assimilate into local culture. And again, it's not that they're assimilating and becoming these great sinners. It's that they're leaving Jewish tradition and they're becoming very productive in European society. They're becoming, members of high study and involvement wherever they go. And so from the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s to about the 1870s, a lot of the proto-Zionist leaders actually, they kind of begin to go, okay, wait a minute, maybe we don't need to go to Palestine to retake the land and make it the Jewish nation, because things are looking kind of good for us here. Like, we're actually, things are kind of okay. There's hope now that we can be assimilated as people and treated like people here among these other cultures and states within European society. And so, so much so that, again, really until the late 1870s, they kind of leave off pushing for a Jewish homeland. Rabbi Alkali, which we talked about earlier, he's one of the people that does this as well. They don't push this idea of the Jews needing their own country. Of course, in the late 1870s and 80s, we see a huge spike in pogroms and anti-Jewish persecution, and so that's when all of that will flip. So we'll see this sort of like this toning down of maybe we can fit in here and live amongst our fellow Germans, Frenchmen, and then of course that changes, particularly in Russia. It's primarily in Russia and Eastern Europe, places like Romania, where a lot of these pogroms and persecutions take place. And so that's what sort of sets off the flip, and now it's like, okay, no, we actually, we need to have our own space. So let's see. The other development, the other developing thought that's sort of, so we kind of have all of these little proto movements in Europe are kind of narrowing into only 2 or 3 branches of thought now. The primary thought, of course, is political. We want a political nation state, something that is a true homeland for the Jewish people. And the other that begins to come about is the development of and the preservation of this idea of what's called the Jewish national spirit. Something that, Rabbi Alkali and others were very concerned with the actual physical survival of the Jewish people, which is why they were fine with the assimilating into European culture, because it meant that they were physically living. The Jewish people were living and thriving, where they were. However, there are others like Moshe Hess. He was one among many. Moshe or Moses Hess, and his last name is spelled Hess. Like the truck company. I don't know if that's related at all. If there's some distant, descendant that has a great truck company or a toy company. I don't even know if they're the real. Were the Hess trucks like a real, thing? Petrol.
Yeah,
Okay.
like so.
Yeah, that's before my time. I played with the toys. I never knew if they were actually real. So, cool. I learned something new today. But anyway, so but him and others were more concerned with the survival of Jewish people as Jewish people. So not just the fact that they lived physically and didn't get killed or brutalized in a pogrom, but that they actually maintained their Jewish identity, this Jewish national spirit, religious practices and traditions, and again, not without having to become Orthodox, because that was kind of the battle. Is like you had this middle ground of we don't want to be Orthodox, but we don't want to be lost and mixed into everyone else. which kind of ironically is how our movement comes to be. Messianic Judaism only exists because there were Jewish people who became believers in the 60s and 70s, largely through American evangelical charismatic circles, who had a desire to retain their Jewishness, to retain that Jewish spirit alongside their newfound belief in Yeshua. And so they made those two work. And so that's what Hess and others are trying to make work as well. We want our kids to be educated. We want them to be the great scientists and mathematicians, but we also want them to be Jews. And that means, being Jewish means doing certain things, or being, certain things, not doing other things. And so a lot of the movements in Jewish circles towards this idea of a Jewish homeland, does anybody remember from their history or social classes what kind of movements were very popular about this time in most of Europe? Late 1800s into early 1900s.
You're talking about like Marxist.
Well, there's Marxism, but I'm talking about the other one, the antithesis to that.
Existentialism.
No, this is political, not so much a philosophical. No, close. Different. Starts with an N. Nationalism. So nationalism is the move of all of these European countries. It's why by the time we get to the First World War, it's why they're all so eager and willing to go to war with each other, because they've developed these identities, these identities fixated in pride of who you are, have developed and grown, and have, Europe is sort of fixating themselves on these. I'm French. What does it mean to be French? I'm German. I'm Prussian. What does it mean to be Prussian? And so all of this is sort of swirling around in the political sphere of Europe at the time, and definitely influencing a lot of these very well-educated and intelligent men and women of the Zionist movements. Like, well, hey, who are we? Like, what kind of national pride can we have as a people? And the nationalism aspect of Zionism drives the establishment for cultural distinctions. So, because guess what? Jews all over Europe are different from each other. German Jews live a little and look a little different than Russian Jews. Same with those who are in France, those who are in America, those who are in England. So there's no one Jewish national identity, and Zionism begins to drive that, and a lot of the leaders begin to acknowledge that. Not only do we have to push for our own self-autonomy back in our own land, we also have to develop a cultural identity that exists, that's distinct from everyone else around us, and that makes us one people. And one of the best examples I was given a book years ago on the history of Israeli dance, what we would call Davidic dance, especially in Messianic circles. And a lot of Israeli dance is relatively new. We're just now kind of getting to where it's a little over 100 years old, that style of dance, because it's developed by multiple pockets of Jewish groups, particularly those in Eastern Europe, Mediterranean basin areas, the Balkans. That's why, when you look at Israeli dance and Russian dance, you're like, okay, these kind of look kind of similar. It's like, well, yeah, because it was developed by Russian Jews who came to the region of Palestine, and they kind of made their own version of it that really spoke the identity of Israel, kind of made it their own identity, their own thing. And so that's why you have different steps. You have different, even some of the dances have different names. There's one dance that we had learned years ago at this point, but the name has to do with quick feet movements, and it's specifically a Yemenite dance, a Jewish Yemenite dance, because it has to do with moving your feet quickly across the sand, because keeping them in one place too long, you burn your feet. And so you kick your sandals off and you dance the dance. No, and that's seriously, that's what the name, that's what the dance is about. I'm not kidding you. The, huh?
That's almost like playing hot potato here. But
Yeah, it's like playing hot potato. And again, these were games and things that they developed. So Zionism pushes the Jewish communities that are scattered and largely have nothing to do with one another to find something to do with one another, and to create this common identity, this common culture, well before they begin moving and immigrating to whether it's Ottoman Palestine at the time or British Palestine, whichever. But well before the Second World War, they're developing these communities, these cultures, which I think is amazing. About this time, late the 80s, 1880s and 90s, this is when Herzl kind of makes his appearance onto the scene. So we're kind of now leaving the proto-Zionist movements. We're leaving sort of these multiple different branches that have kind of sprung up in all parts of different within Europe, and are kind of melding together now. And Herzl kind of takes them all and unites them and brings together all of these different leaders and groups and ideas in what's called the First Zionist Congress of 1897. And he had an interesting take on anti-Semitism. At least I think it was interesting. One, he was very confident that he had all the answers to anti-Semitism and to why it was a problem and to how they could solve it. His first problem, or his first sort of answer to anti-Semitism, and is that it was a problem of nationality. So Herzl was not identifying anti-Semitism in a way that was driven by demons or the wicked hearts of men, which I would argue that some of it definitely is. But it was a problem for him of nationality. There's, again, growing nationalism within Europe. Who are you? And are you proud to be who you are? Why are you what you are? And the Jewish people are a people that largely exist without a nation. They are a national people, a national group without a place to call home. If you go anywhere in the world today as an American, and a lot of us are different. You meet, it's like we were talking with Rick and Catherine with your granddaughter about the differences between some of us that live in the north and some of us that live in the south. We're different, but we still identify as, and we have shared traditions, shared things that make us a national group. And the Jewish people are the same way. So Herzl's idea is we have a problem of being a national people without a nation. We're subject to, of course, discriminations and superstitions due to a lot of practices of the church in the past, persecutions by different groups in the past, different kingdoms. Now, of course, it's important to remember that discrimination to minorities in Europe is not like an exception. It's the rule. So it's not that the Jews are just being picked on because they're Jews. It's because they're minority. They're like, the only reason we hear about them today is because they've actually lived through all of it and have successfully thrived. But if you read through history, there are a lot of other minorities in Europe we don't read about them today because they don't exist anymore. They're killed off, persecuted out of existence. Sadly, that is the norm in Europe for centuries, up until recently, really, only within the last 200 years or so has that been something that the world has kind of collectively said no. Because you think, right up until the First World War, like we even had, the Armenian genocide, which happened to the Armenians, within the Ottoman Empire. It was not they were experiencing what everyone who was not the norm would have experienced in Europe. Herzl also kind of ran with the idea that it's not individual Jews that are necessarily hated, but it's the collective, because, you know, obviously in his time, Jewish people are tending to thrive. You know, they're thriving in their trades. You know, if they're working in, again, particularly in the university system, they're doing very well. So it's not the individual Jew that's hated by the anti-Semites, but it's the national collective. So, and he also had the idea that if we build, you know, kind of like if we build it, they will come. If we set out to build a Jewish nation, the Gentiles will actually help us to build it. You know, because they'll be glad that we're building something for ourselves finally. So he had this kind of self-deprecating almost kind of view of what, you know, why anti-Semitism existed. I don't know if I would agree with him, but I can see where he's coming from. Let's see. So he establishes the first Congress in 1897, and this becomes the place where they sort of make decisions on behalf of all Zionists. When they begin looking to secure land in the future, this is the place where they will kind of convene and vote and decide on where particularly they're looking. He ardently pushes, up till his dying day, that the goal of the Zionists is to obtain a specifically political charter, something that is recognized internationally, that will give them unchallengeable sovereignty wherever they decide to establish the nation. And of course, you know, when Israel is established, there are some nations who are like, yes, go. And there are other nations who are like, absolutely not. So they've succeeded, but, you know, in Herzl's eyes, I think there would still be this like, well, maybe we didn't succeed as well as we could have. But again, there's so much that happened in the establishment of the State of Israel. A lot of it was very rushed. The British were on their way out of the country. They were like, we're done with this. We're done dealing with the terrorism. We're done dealing with the infighting. We're gone. And so they moved quickly to establish themselves as a sovereign state. And, you know, there were some countries that didn't like that. Those countries also happened to lose the war. So, I mean, you know, it's sort of like, you know, if you're gonna show up, show out, you know. And they did not. Let's see. Herzl was adamant that, you know, all this had to be done wholesale. You could not do this in pieces. So to establish a Jewish state, you could not do it brick by brick. You literally had to drop the nation there where it was, which I think, had circumstances been different from what they were in British Palestine, I think we probably would, had things worked out differently time-wise, I think we probably would not have seen Israel establish itself as a state until probably the 50s or 60s. And it possibly would have been done with less conflict. Again, more of Herzl's way of probably doing it, you know, get everything squared away. There's no super divided up or questioned parts of land. It's just, this is the Jewish nation. Let's find a place to agree. We all agree. Sign here. There. We're done. Got it. Wholesale. And Herzl's thing was political entirely. He was actually opposed to the cultural element of Zionism. He was not a huge fan of developing sort of this Hebraic, quote unquote, return to our Jewish roots kind of deal. He was fine with them being the modern Jews. They were just with having a political enterprise that would be a place where they could, again, be autonomous and be protected from those who hated them, mostly, again, because they have their own nation. And they're no longer a people without a nation. They're no longer a national people without a nation. He was opposed to the idea of the nation's language being Hebrew, particularly when it comes to the language that was developed, the Hebrew dialect that was developed by Eliezer ben Yehuda, who really kind of he creates modern Hebrew, takes ancient Hebrew and develops and makes words, and that becomes That is what they speak today in Israel. It's also the language that begins to be adopted by a lot of the Jewish settlers who are there when the British are under control. But Herzl and a lot of those in charge of the Zionist Congress did not want it to be Hebrew. They wanted it to be German. They wanted it to, because German was, and arguably is, still the academic language of the time. That's it. If you're studying math, German. If you're studying physics, German. If you're studying theology, German. Like that's where everything is in German at the Egyptology. If you want to study ancient Egypt, guess what language you better be able to read? German. So Herzl and a lot of them are, again, they're coming out of that, particularly that German university academic mindset. I mean, das University of Würzburg. It's like that's where, University of Heidelberg, and others. That's where they're coming from. So they want it to be modern. They want it to be something that the rest of the world can recognize as something that is relevant, I guess. So anyway, so he's against all that. But as he passes, Zionism kind of shifts again back into this, okay, yeah, we want the political aspect. We want to be a nation state, but we also need to have our own culture. And we need to push for cultural development. And there's a gentleman by the name of Chaim Weizmann, and he coins the term, he calls what they're trying to do synthetic Zionism. So synthetic Zionism. It's this blending of the political and the national Jewish culture, growth and identity. And it's important to note that this is when, at this point, after Herzl passes, it begins to take on, Zionism takes on more of a socialist mindset. Its worldview, its lens becomes more socialist. But again, a lot of these guys were friends with Marx. Like a lot of them knew Marx personally, if they weren't just students of his or followers of his teachings. So that's why, as you see Jewish groups going to Ottoman and British Palestine and settling. What do we call them? Kibbutz, kibbutzim. What are they? They're little communities. How do they run? They run in the communist system, and they work very well. And that's political discussion for another time, perhaps. But they go with that mentality, and they begin to thrive in the land there. But that's also why Israel is the way it is today. How it runs things today is more of a socialist, democratic state, less of a republic. In German, the word they use for what they're trying to develop and do is Gegenwartsarbeit, it means to work in the present. So we may not be in British Mandate Palestine right now developing a Jewish nation, but we have work to do where we are here in the diaspora to prepare our grandchildren for when they're going to be there living in the land. So they're developing modern Jewish education. There's this heightened focus on sports and athleticism. So no longer are we people who sit in the study hall all day poring over Talmud and the Torah, but we are people who are athletic. We dance for fun, very energetic and athletic dances. We're playing sports. We're outside all the time. We're learning to garden, to be agrarian. We're learning to use weapons for self-defense, learning to use tools, learning to build things, preparing to have this unified culture across Judaism that as people are moving from Russia, from Romania, from Germany, from France, from Spain, from parts of North Africa, as they're coming to what they hope is, again, to be this Jewish nation, this Jewish state, that there will already be a unified culture that develops around hard work, and a commitment to being healthy not only for yourself but for your people, to be able to serve your community, your people. And we see elements of this still today. Young people in Israel, male and female, you serve in the army, you serve in the military, you serve your country before going off and doing whatever it is that you decide is worth committing your life to. Let's see. So this is about the time we see Zionist groups begin to immigrate from Europe and settling into Ottoman Palestine. It's still under Ottoman control. This is right at the beginning of the First World Wars, early 1900s. But it's not the only land that's looked at. There is if you'll notice as I've been going through, how I've been phrasing things is how they phrase things. The region of Judea, of Ottoman Palestine, was always at the top of the list of what we want. But they were also not opposed to anything else that was just eventually going to be able to get them away from Europe as a collective, as a place. And so you have, at one point, there's a large swath of land in Uganda that is actually considered to becoming the place for the Jewish state. As the British are kind of pulling out of parts of Africa, and there are certain British politicians that were all too happy to cede part of that land to the Zionist cause to create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, and they do consider it. The Zionist Congress considers this prospect, particularly because at this time there was another big, wave of pogroms in Russia, and so you have all these Russian Jews who are now refugees fleeing, and the Zionist Congress, part of the Zionist Congress is, their thought process is, let's create a place now that we can get all of these thousands of Russian Jews to be able to go to a place that's safe for them, and this kind of divides the Congress a bit. You have some people who are like, absolutely not. It's like we are going back to our ancestral homeland. We're not going anywhere else but there. And then you have some who are like, well, we should just, anywhere that's offered to us, we should take. And so this kind of divides them up. Ultimately, the Congress decides not to go this route, but it was a thought. It was a consideration by the Zionist Congress to build a Jewish state out of a place that is rather far from the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. So again, but this is a very human thing. Like this is people are making decisions and moving, and after 1925, any factions that are even considering looking at any other land for the Jewish state, they kind of cease to exist. At that point, after 1925, it's all about British Mandate Palestine becoming, and the British actually, in many ways, are considering giving this to, again, the Balfour Declaration is made about this time, sort of with this intention to give at least part of the Palestinian region to the Jewish people, and to create, again, you'll hear today when they talk about the two-state solution. That was from the beginning, that was the idea. And it was the Arab coalitions rejected that idea because the Jews were very happy to have that, because they were going to finally have something. And of course, they ended up having to fight to even try to keep what little that they did have. So British Mandate Palestine becomes the focus of the Zionist Congress attention. But now we've kind of arrived full circle. The only thing left from here, we already have settlements in British Palestine. So you have Jewish communities all throughout World War II. You have Jewish communities living and thriving in British Palestine. And then, of course, we have the Holocaust. So the Jews who have been working so hard to prepare this move to this region of the world, they are, many of them are killed in the Holocaust, of course. And many of them do flee, but a lot of them don't end up fleeing to there. A lot of them end up fleeing to America, to England. And so the Holocaust and the Nazis kind of disrupt all of this planning and moving towards this idea of this Jewish homeland. And it's like, man, if there were ever anything that seemed just late enough, because you think about how many millions may have moved by the time the Nazis gained power, but again, so many of them were comfortable. Many of them did not have any intention of leaving Germany or Holland or France. They were very comfortable where they were comfortable positions. You make it to you become a professor with tenure. It's an achievement. But a lot of them just did not see the handwriting on the wall quick enough, and those that did escape and were able to flee. And a lot of those that survived the Holocaust, that survived the brutality of the Nazi regime, a lot of them will end up moving to British Palestine, which then not too long after they move there, it becomes the state of Israel. And so it's imperative to remember in a lot of these discussions that you'll have with folks that, because obviously, it's a hot topic right now on campuses, it's a hot topic on social media, in the news, that approach people already with an understanding that they may just not know. Some people just don't know. They may not have an understanding of the complexity and of the very recent events that have happened. I mean, Israel is a baby country. Like we think of it like, 1948, God, this is so long ago. It's like, no, like there are people still alive today who were living young adult lives in 48. It's not that long ago. And that some of these people may not hate Jewish people. Some of them do. There are those. And, God have mercy on them. But if you approach people with the benefit of the doubt, then they may just learn something from you. They may learn about what Zionism really is. They may learn that Zionism is intrinsic to the existence of the Jewish people today, and that is one of the things that has allowed for them to survive in countries that didn't want them, and has given them a country where now they can live in relative peace, free from persecution. At the beginning, I know I'm going to wrap up, when I was talking about, one could argue today that there is no such thing as a Zionist, because Zionism, the purpose and the goal of Zionism was to solidify and build a homeland for the Jewish people. They have that. There is a homeland for the Jewish people. One that comes to the aid of the Jewish people internationally when they need it, and one that protects the Jewish people living within its borders. Zionism accomplished its goal. So, in accomplishing its goal, it would be safe to say that you no longer are capable of being an anti-Zionist. At this point, if you are anti-Jew, you can't be. You can be anti-Jew, but you can't be anti-Zionist. And so people have to be honest about what it is they're against. Now, it doesn't mean Israel's not above criticism. There are plenty within Israel that criticize Israel. So, it's a country like any of ours. It has human beings leading it. Human beings cause problems. And so and human beings outside of that country cause problems. Hamas was outside of Israel's control. Causes lots of issues for Israel. So it's my argument and opinion, which you are welcome to adopt, that there is no such thing as a Zionist today because there is a state of Israel today. It accomplished its goal. So clarify with people when you're discussing, do you have criticisms about Israel or are you anti-Jew? Because those two are very different things, and you can be one of those things, but you cannot be anti-Zionist because that doesn't exist, and you can't be opposed to something that doesn't exist. So, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so now Palestine, they've never been a state.
No.
Where they never had their own country. I mean,
No.
what have they really done?
It's always been ruled by different folks. a lot of the folks that what we would call the Palestinians, they're a lot of them are migrants from the Arabian Peninsula. Now, again, they're migrants that came there in like the 400s, 500s, and 600s. So those people have been there a long time. It's not, but there was never a nation. You know, Rome ruled that region until the fall of the West, until the Roman Empire divides. It's ruled by the Eastern Empire for, hundreds of years, and then of course the Ottomans end up taking over. The Arabs, the Muslims, the Muslim conquest take over the region, so it's ruled and becomes a largely Muslim region for hundreds of years, and that's about the time we see the Crusades. And of course, even during the Crusades, we see that there are not just Muslims living there, but Christians and Jews. Jews never really leave the region. Like there's small pockets of them throughout. They're just not the majority. And of course, the Ottoman Empire develops and it rules for a while, and then at the end of the First World War, the British take it and they rule it through the Second World War, and then it's after the Second World War that they give it up. So it's not that, but yeah, Palestine has never been a country. It's never been a state, as we understand statehood to be. It's always been ruled up until when Rome takes over. It pretty much exists as a imperial or a caliphate power. So it's either being ruled by a Western empire or a Muslim empire, up until the British take control of it. So Palestine has never existed as, when people are talking about Palestine, they talk about it as if it's like Germany, where it has a flag and a constitution and a traceable leadership and government, and it doesn't have that. Now, it does not mean, it does not mean that those people there don't have their own culture, their own cuisine, their own way of dress. They're human beings as well. So, and many of them have been there for generations. I was listening to a talk the other day where there was a Christian family that had lived in, I think, Bethlehem, and they've been there for 10 generations. So they have a lot of them have lived there a while. But again, there's never been a Palestinian country or state. So.
Has that land ever been called anything other than Israel?
Oh yeah, I mean it was called part of Egypt at one point. It was part of Rome at one point. It was part of Byzantium at one point, the Eastern Roman Empire. So yeah, I mean it's been called other things, but until it was the state of Israel, the last thing it was British Mandate Palestine. It was just a region of the world that was controlled by Britain, parceled off after the First World War. So yes, sir.
Do we have grounds to really question the philosophical underpinnings of all this? I see a confluence of things. We're talking about European nationalism, we're talking Marxism, we're talking existentialism, we're talking a whole host of ideas.
Right. There's a lot of ideas
And then there's this almost it's almost like an afterthought of Judaism.
Right.
And so it almost seems like, is it actually legitimate, or is it just based on philosophical inquiry?
Well, the movement is Jewish, because you have to remember, how much of when Israel comes into the land, even the first time, how many times could we have said, well, they messed up here, so is it legitimate that they're inheriting this, promise or whatever? I mean, when they come in with Joshua, no one has been circumcised in 40 years. That's
They're following the Torah, but then not following.
Right. And that's where, you have, again, you have sort of this split between, the secularists and the Orthodox, and, it doesn't mean no Orthodox didn't participate and come, because we know there were plenty that did. But there it is, how the world works and all of its complexities. And that's why when people say, like, I've got an answer to a 200+ year problem, with my 2 years of college brainwashing, it's like, no, dude, I'm sorry, you don't. Like, this is a very complex, movement of God and man. And so
you would view it as like synergy between like a movement of God and a movement of man, and not just a man-based attempt.
Right. There's,
to bring about
there are things, everything in the world that happens in the world, God allows to happen, and ultimately to His purposes. And so, Israel exists today for God's purposes. What that looks like in the future, I don't know. But, it's. But yeah, I mean, it develops out of interesting places, but.
So, like an evangelical would say, this is a fulfillment of prophecy.
Oh yeah.
Whereas, like, is it really a fulfillment of prophecy, or is it going to be?
Yeah, I take the position of going to be.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm more of a futurist myself.
Right. Yeah, I take the position of going to be. Yeah.
So 48 isn't the prophesied future state.
Yeah, I don't think
Okay,
48
cool.
is. Yeah. No.
Back
'Cause
up.
yeah, that's fine. That's my position, and I'm willing to be corrected if I'm wrong. But there's, the burden of proof really isn't on me.
Precisely.
So, so right. So.
possible it's the beginning of the
Yeah, the beginnings of some of God's restoration of the Jewish people, and that's where I differ from like the evangelical communities. I'm like the beginnings of God redeeming the Jewish people to Himself. Will they turn to Messiah? Because of the things that they have to battle against in the world. Sure, but was 48 this like cataclysmic, over the top prophetic event? I don't have any reason to believe that, and I don't believe things unless I have a very good reason to. So, right. So yeah, I think it's definitely the beginning of something, and we're just all kind of privileged to see it happen in real time. So, any other questions, comments? No? All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for the night then, and we will probably turn this into a part 2, because there is a ton of stuff more to go over, but I can only fit so much.